Thank you for watching this virtual lecture event hosted by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, a doctoral program, and 2 new online Master of Arts programs. If you're interested in learning more about us, please visit iwp.edu. This lecture event is part of the 11th Annual Kościuszko Chair Spring Symposium in honor of Lady Blanka Rosenstiel. This event is sponsored by the Kościuszko Chair in Polish Studies and the Center for Intermarium Studies. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from Dr. Jack Ziak. Dr. Ziak is a consultant in the fields of intelligence, counterintelligence, counter-deception, and national security affairs. He has served over 5 decades as a company president and as a senior intelligence officer and senior executive in the Office of the Secretary of Defense in the Defense Intelligence Agency, with long experience in counterintelligence, hostile deception, counter-deception, strategic intelligence, weapons proliferation intelligence, and intelligence education. He received his PhD in Russian history from Georgetown University, is a graduate of the National War College, and is a recipient of numerous defense and intelligence awards and citations. He is an adjunct professor at the Institute of World Politics and has taught at the National War College, National Intelligence University, Georgetown University, and the George Washington University, and lectures on intelligence, military affairs, and security issues throughout the U.S. and abroad. Dr. Ziak, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Ron. Ladies and gentlemen, let me add my welcome to what Okhrana has stated concerning the Kościuszko Chair, and I will be discussing the art of provocation this evening. Provocation is something that is part and parcel of what's called the counterintelligence-state. Next slide, please. What is the CI state, counterintelligence-state? Well, before provocation, there was the counterintelligence-state. The counterintelligence-state, which is endemic throughout history, especially with despotic regimes, you see characterization of it in other systems as well. In such a state, counterintelligence seems to be the modus operandi for keeping itself in power. And it involves the discovery and elimination of perceived conspiracies, enemies, and it characterizes the motivations and behavior of the ruling class or the ruling entity, whatever it is. Its purposes and methods are not simply to identify and arrest others and impress the leadership, but the idea is to penetrate, control, manipulate, perceive, real, or notional fake enemies to further the state's ends. And always the counterintelligence services target, first and foremost, the domestic population. And that's in the fulfillment of their mission. Population always is the real potential or imagined enemy. The Cheka, the first security service, first counterintelligence service of the new Soviet Union, which, by the way, was formed before they even had a standing army, that tells you something about their priorities. Cheka, like the Okhrana before it, was a counterintelligence service. It was not a foreign intelligence service. Counterintelligence reigned in many respects in the successor Russian Federation. Counterintelligence still reigns. Traditionally, in such systems, foreign intelligence is really viewed as external counterintelligence. The counterintelligence ethos and imperative rule in such systems. Next slide. So getting to provocation, what does this entail? What does it mean? It really connotes operational counterintelligence techniques that create conditions to instigate real or imagined opponents into action that would serve the state's objectives at the expense of the opponent. Now, usually in such systems, they begin with the domestic population. But in the more modern period, especially following the Soviet victory in 1917, it took on foreign dimensions as well. In fact, this was so critical to them that it provocation occupies its own entry in a KGB top secret dictionary. And it puts it this way: provocation is the deliberate artificial creation of a situation and condition causing the commission of a crime by another person or persons. You can take that writ large to groups as well and countries. The direct instigation of this person towards the commission of the crime is with the aim of their subsequent exposure and bringing to trial. Okay? That's at the practical level. The idea here is to really start something that otherwise would not necessarily occur, control the opponent, and ultimately put him out of existence, or even better, in many respects, keep controlling him or them for some other long-range political or operational purpose. This may be at the tactical level, that is, a double agent operation aimed at discrediting an enemy intelligence service, or at the strategic level, such as the trust and the win operation, which we'll discuss shortly. Operations that were focused on both domestic and foreign enemies and foreign intelligence services, which were the vectors for these operations. Double agent operations are central to the above, both tactical and strategic, in the tradition of Sun Tzu. So we see that these have been around for a long time, and it's endemic to the counterintelligence state. Next slide. Now, I have a little more on provocation here. And this involves a practitioner who countered deception from the period between World War I and World War II. He's a legendary Polish intelligence officer, counterintelligence officer. He's also a journalist who worked against the trust, the first truly strategic deception operation conducted by the Soviets. And again, this was between World War I and World War II. His name was Richard Braga. That wasn't his real name. It was a non de jure, so to speak. He gave several lectures on provocation in the 1950s to British military intelligence schools, military and intelligence schools. I never met him. I met his widow about a year after he died. So I have some familiarity. I knew her. I gave a lecture on how she put together the work disinformation, which we discussed at the Institute here several weeks ago. And he actually clarifies the above Soviet definition by elevating it beyond mere police state tactical style provocation to its true political strategic dimensions, state to state dimensions, so to speak. Let me quote here from him in one of his studies, taken from the lectures that he gave. They were to British and French schools, senior intelligence and military schools. I actually have copies of two of the lectures. Third one, I don't know where that is. I received his widow's papers, but that was not among them. But he says, the subject of my report, i.e. his lecture, is provocation. When I say, that is Braga says provocation, I do not mean it in the narrow sense of the word, which refers to police provocation, tactical level operation, so to speak. But I mean political provocation. This definition is important, which is of fundamental significance in the organization and tactics of the secret service, whether it's counterintelligence or intelligence services. The word provocation is understood to mean penetration into the enemy's camp with the purpose of taking over direction of the enemy's activity. That's the ultimate objective. Inspiring the enemy with concrete views or inciting him to undertake actions intended to lead to his own defeat, meaning he participates in his own demise. Well, Braga's description captures the essence of provocation in its full geopolitical sense. It is in this sense that counterintelligence states have employed this classic counterintelligence device on a strategic scale. You can find this in early vestiges, whether among the Chinese centuries ago, seen from Sun Tzu, or with the Mongols, or even in pre-Columbian America, in the Aztec and Inca civilization. See elements of this. Excellent. Now, before I proceed any further, let me bring in other related terminology that we find in U.S. intelligence, Western intelligence idiom, but also in the idiom of other intelligence services and traditional counterintelligence structures, counterintelligence states, counterintelligence empires, despotisms. One of the items that directly relates to provocation is reflexive control. The Soviets have done a lot of work on this, especially in the post-World War II period, where high technology was coming online and computers began making their appearance. It has mostly a military significance and implication, and the idea is to control the enemy military's action. It really is a subset of provocation. We find the term ruse also, artifice and strategy, which are common in the Western idiom, but which captures a great deal of the meaning of provocation. You go back to the Russians again, diversiya or diversion. We would see also Western analogs of provocation, such as sting operation, police types, sting operation, or false flag operation. We have seen many of these, even domestically, in recent years, very recent years. We can move to other systems and other societies as well. For instance, a term common in Islamic language, in the Arabic language rather, and Islamic terminology would be taqiyya, and related terms in Islam. In fact, the term ruse, the second one up there, was the subject of a book. The title of it was The Subtle Ruse, a book of Arabic wisdom in guile, published first in Arabic several centuries ago, then translated into the French, and later, I think in 1980, into the English. So you see, one witnesses the meanings behind provocation that appear in other societies as well. We can move as well to controlled opposition. That's organic to provocation. When you penetrate the enemy, you recruit him wittingly or not, and control his operation. This would include opposition camps within, for instance, the Russian Revolution, where controlled opposition entailed penetrating Mensheviks, the socialist revolutionaries, and so forth. And that applies to other systems as well that might not necessarily be despotic. Then you come up to another term that we find in the Soviet counterintelligence idiom, that of kombinatsiya, combination, where a number of these activities and initiatives, stratagem, reflexive control, deception, disinformation, are used concurrently and in an organized fashion. For instance, provocation would itself be a provocational operation would itself be a kombinatsiya, a combination. And then we come to terms we're very familiar with, especially in recent years: deception, disinformation, active measures. The terminology is very critical here, especially when we go to the sources in the Soviet and pre-Soviet analogs. Active measures at one time connoted hit operation, assassination. When the Soviets realized we were catching on to their terminology, they got rid of the terminology used for active measures used as a means of killing people, and related it mostly to deception and disinformation. Another element of provocation, which is critical to provocation, would be directed information through controlled channels, i.e., when you penetrate the enemy through a double agent operation. And a double agent operation would mean that their agent is the double agent. They really own that person. This is the essence of Sun Tzu's definition of double agent operation. Then you could pass controlled information, deceptive information, through those channels to cause your enemy to behave in a manner detrimental to his interests and serving your interests. Other terms, and there are myriad terms beyond what I'm raising here, are maskirovka, a term related mostly to military deception. There's a tendency to refer to that strictly as camouflage. It entails much more than just camouflage. It includes deception and disinformation. And something more recent, associated, for instance, with hybrid warfare that we've seen coming down the pike from the contemporary Russian Federation, informationaya borba, information confrontational, information struggle, information activities. Okay. Next slide. All right, moving away from definitions, let's look at people a little bit here. There are certain individuals who are central to the development of provocation as an art form raised to high strategic levels. One of these was the individual on the left, Art of Provocation, first chief of Cheka's counterintelligence. Cheka was the first counterintelligence service that I mentioned before. Again, before they had a military, a standing military, before they had a foreign intelligence element, they had counterintelligence. That was Cheka. Kościuszko was the chief of counterintelligence. He was the designer, along with Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky. I put iron in quotes because this man was made of iron. Your previous speaker, Professor Hodakevich, was giving you a lot more detail. He was, man was a monster, a complete monster, mass murderer. By the way, Artusov's original name came from a Swiss Italian family. You had a number of specialists who migrated to Imperial Russia during the reign of Peter the Great, who provided technical services to Peter the Great's design for a new capital in what became St. Petersburg, later Petrograd and Leningrad, and now reversed, gone back to St. Petersburg. His real name was Frauchi, not Fauci, Frauchi. He died, by the way, as did many of the star performers and leaders of the Soviet intelligence services during the purges. He was one of the victims that were targeted when they went after, and Stalin went after the security services. So Dzerzhinsky, along with Artusov, were the real designers of your major operations that began almost immediately after the creation of the Soviet Union and then during the Civil War in 1917 onwards. One of these was the trust, which we'll look at later. And you had a situation here where not only Artusov and Dzerzhinsky participated in masterminding these grand strategic scale provocations and deception, you had the political leadership rolling up their sleeves and participating as well. You don't see this in Western society. Next graphic, please. I want to bring up here a nice little text. It's a primer, not a textbook per se, but it's a primer on provocation. Written by a Polish dissident back in the early 1960s. It wasn't translated to English until 2009. And the author's name is Joseph Puszkiewicz. And the title is The Triumph of Provocation. I found this book just startling in that it captured the essence at the heart of taking over not only your own society, but foreign societies as well. And having been a witness to what happened in Poland, his book, which I commend to, not only has the techniques on how this was used in Poland to the creation and use of the Polish Communist Party, but for instance, he has a standalone chapter on trust, which I also commend. And we'll look at trust a little bit as we move into it. Next one, please. Let's look at some sample listings of provocation. Now, this is not all inclusive. These are just a few to give a flavor of not only what happened in the past, but how the ethos has continued down through all the decades of Soviet history, and not only Soviet history, but others as well. You see this finding China, PRC today, using similar techniques. Chinese terminology may be a little bit different, but we're talking about some of the same things. Where when we talk about double agent operations, that's still core, but that's all been enhanced by the internet, by cyber warfare, and so forth. The fact that you get an exponential expansion of the capability of provocation, and it becomes even more dangerous. Let's go back to the earliest times. Very soon after the Bolshevik coup in October 1917, and I use the old Julian calendar because they still refer to it as the Great October, the so-called Lockhart plot, or the Ambassador's plot. This was a provocation wherein they set up a phony operation, an accusation that Western political presence in Petrograd, later became Leningrad, were conspiring to bring down the Soviet leadership. Now, to be sure, there were concerns after the Bolsheviks pulled Russia out of World War I and then made a separate peace with Germany. So they had to run operations to get a little bit of projection here. They're so used to running provocations, they just took it for granted that provocations were being run against them. In many respects, yes, they were, but they were nowhere near as widespread, comprehensive, and effective as Soviet provocation. Lockhart plot was a notional plot. It didn't really exist. Other movements that came up around the same time, I say the same time, I'm talking about the period during the Civil War, which went from basically 1918 to 1921, and in the first years thereafter. We had all kinds of provocations involving notional opposition groups, or groups that were there in reality, but very, very sketchy, not very effective, such as residuals of the monarchist movements, or intellectual movements like the signpost movements, the Dickey movement in pre-revolutionary Russian literature. And they came up with one called the change of signposts. It was a provocation designed to capture and implicate the intellectuals, non-Bolshevik intellectuals, who were potential points of opposition to the Bolsheviks. And then you also have the Eurasian movement, which I find very interesting because you see evocations of that today with Alexander Dugin, and he is one of the supporters of the Russian presidency of Putin. And that's a carryover from the Eurasian movement of the 20s and 1930s. But the real classic was the trust. They have written about it, Richard Braga, Natalie Braga, others have written about it. The trust was the prototype of a classic strategic provocation and deception, wherein they targeted what was left of the domestic opposition and organized them into a notional opposition called by various names the monarchist movement of Central Russia, or Motsev, the Cyrillic Russian um, abbreviation for it, or the Trust, or trust. And the trust invoked also the beginnings of the new economic policy. So it was tapping into a existing sentiment that they organized for their own purpose. It began in Russia and then moved to the immigration, especially the White Army residuals, the WAVs, operating in Paris. And then it included the Western intelligence service. And it ran from roughly 1921 until 26 to 27. It was against the trust that Richard Wraga and other members of the Polish General Staff and Intelligence Service won their spur in countering that and gave them the first opportunities for counter-penetrating the Soviets. Along with the trust, and we saw residuals of trust going down through World War II, where former trust operatives, former white officers, who were KGB assets, I should say, and KGB assets, were picked up by the Nazis, and then later picked up by Western intelligence, including the Army's counterintelligence corps and the new fledgling CIA. So they were taken in by later survivors of the trust. One of the things we learned from the early immigration and the fact was not only that there were movements like the trust and the Eurasian movement, changed signposts, etc. There were 40 other provocations and deceptions that were running, which we have very little knowledge of. Other examples included the provocation that the Nazi Germans provoked on the Polish-German frontier in 1939. It gave an excuse, a lame excuse, but it gave an excuse for the launch of the German invasion from the west and the Soviet invasion from the east. People forget that there was a devil's deal between Stalin and Hitler at the expense of Poland and the Western Alliance. There were various operations, numerous operations of provocations and grand strategic deceptions on the Eastern Front run by the Soviet Union. One of them was the Monastir operation, wherein Reinhard Gehlen's Foreign Army East was targeted for years by the NKVD and later NKVD in a major operation where they presented a notional penetration of the general staff, the Soviet general staff, that the Germans bought into. Gehlen, even after the war, considered that operation one of his most successful, and it was a provocation, and he still didn't catch on. A major one after the war was the WIN. That's the Polish abbreviation for Freedom and Independence, also known as Operation Cezare on the Polish and Soviet side. It targeted Poland and Eastern Europe, residuals of the Home Army, and there was an actual freedom and independence movement, but it was captured and then run by a combination of Polish and Soviet intelligence. They took in the intelligence services of the United States and the UK, and it ran for a number of years, in the immediate post-war years up until 1950. We see provocations being run against the Hungarian rebels that resulted in the invitation of Imre Nagy and Paul Molitor, the Hungarian general, went over to the rebels. Imre Nagy was the Communist Party chief who revolted against the Soviets, and they were provoked into a meeting and arrested at a meeting, a peace meeting, and arrested at this meeting by the Soviets. Later chief of the KGB and then General Secretary Yuri Andropov, who was the ambassador in Budapest, orchestrated. We saw provocations being run not only against the communist Czechoslovak government prior to the Warsaw Pact invasion in 1968, but against Western intelligence as well. I was a fairly new, only 3 years into my new career in intelligence, and we were reading intelligence that basically included directed information coming at us about Soviet intentions. It was all part of a grand-scale provocation to deception operation. This is where warning intelligence comes in very, very critical. If you don't have the sophisticated analytical capability to understand the mindset and the nature of counterintelligence-state systems, you're going to miss provocations that are being run because they're fed into the system. They're fed into the warning stream of intelligence, whether it's human or other systems that they control. Systems, overhead systems, and now in the age of the internet, the web. We saw Soviet provocation operations to provoke the Arabs in Syria and in Egypt in the work up to the 1973 Yom Kippur War. And then later after the war, in the air war that the Soviets basically ran after the victory of the Israelis in Sinai. And a lot of directed information coming out of that as well. Let's jump up to 1978, for instance, with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which was a puppet regime to begin with. But they had leaders that they distrusted, such as Kamal and others, and they ran provocations and deceptions against their own puppet communist regime. In that operation, Soviet Special Forces, Spetsnaz, from both the GRU and from the KGB, played special roles in all of it. Let's run the calendar up even closer to more recent times, active measures campaigns in the 1980s. Not only was there an explosion of active measures campaigns, and this followed the post-Stalin reorientation of Soviet foreign policy with the ascension of Khrushchev in the mid-1950s. I think he replaced a triumvirate before him and took over the government as General Secretary or head of the Presidium in 1956. And they embarked on a new program of foreign policy that used active measures as a major element. This reached crescendo levels in the 1980s, along with major penetrations of Western and especially U.S. intelligence. I was personally and heavily involved in the fallout of this, where from the White House was ordered the creation of a special senior level unit that did very careful evaluation of these penetrations and the potential for passing deceptive information through the channels of these penetrations, and then made part of active measures campaign. There was a lot of resistance in the intelligence community, elements of the intelligence community, to recognizing the fact that we were susceptible to such things. And in fact, some of the terminology that was used against it was sick thinking. If you thought that we could be subverted by active measures campaigns, then you were sick in your thinking. That characterized a lot of. Bring it up to today, we see the PRC and its embedded presence in myriad U.S. and Western institutions. This is a serious, serious problem. One of the major differences between the PRC and the Soviet Union is in the realm of open publications. The Soviets were very, very careful about what they released in open publications. And they even controlled very carefully the more open of their books in special channels. That was one of the responsibilities of attachés, to go around the Soviet Union in areas that were not denied and try to pick up some of these publications. And then from that, we were able to glean a lot of things that were then leavened with classified information. The Chinese were much more forward and in publicizing such things as, for instance, unrestricted warfare, where they lay out their plans for penetrating and provoking through penetration Western institutions, up to and including governments. Okay? You can use your imagination on that. I term it critical. Next one, please. All right, as we're getting near to closing this out, let me put some thinking into the meaning of it. I'd like to compare provocation to the grandmaster chess game of political work. Provocation is a subset of political work. Okay? We are in and have been in a game of political warfare since 1917. It hasn't gone away. One of the mistakes we made, going back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, was a peace broke out. We actually had a station chief in one of our outposts in what used to be the Soviet Union turned down the offered defection of a man by the name of Mikrokin, who offered to bring out troves of classified information. And one of the reasons for turning it down was that we're at peace. We're partners now. Okay? The Brits, on the other hand, when he came to them, welcomed him with open arms and said, "Welcome, comrade." And so we got the McCrocken papers. Second point, ignoring or denying provocation is to preemptively concede a contest without actually realizing you're in a contest to begin with. Okay? Denial that these happen is not a strategy, nor is it intelligence or counterintelligence. Okay? We used to be able to do this. We knew how to do this. We knew how to work. We knew how to play the counter-deception game very well against a lot of internal opposition. That disappeared. When the intelligence community gave up on institutionalized counter-deception and strategic warning, let me add that as a result of the expanded and close attention that we made following White House decisions in the early 1980s, a network and national level counter-deception organizations were set up throughout the intelligence community. These had mostly disappeared. So what happened was a signal was sent to the Art of Provocation, basically, intercraft. I want to thank you for your attention, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.